Hello, and welcome to another Saugatuck Scribes interview, the Westport Library series that highlights our own Westport authors and their newest books. Usually, I'm introducing two adult writers or two grown-ups talking about a book for grown-ups, but today we are talking about a middle school book with a middle school teacher and a Westport writer, which is super exciting. Tommy Greenwald is the author of Rivals, which he'll be talking about to us about today, as well as many other children's books, including the CRIMEBITERS series, the Charlie Joe Jackson books, and his most recent book before Rivals is called Game Changer. You might know Kerstin Rao as a middle school teacher at Bedford Middle School, and she's also a collaborator on several innovative programs at the Westport Library. So without further ado, take it away.
Oh my gosh, isn't this so fun, Tommy? I'm so happy to be here with you.
Yes, we've known each other for years and years. It's nice to see you again.
We have actually. I think I've gotten to know all three of your boys as they were going through the school
That's a great
system.
backdrop, by the way. Is that real? Pull a book off the shelf so I know it's
Girl,
real.
I'll do better than that. I'm
Oh.
pulling Wonder Woman off the shelf. Nah.
Very
So
nice.
we're off to a great start for middle school readers, aren't we? Like right out of the gate.
You got a lot of books. I'm impressed. I'm scouring the shelf of my books. So far, I don't see anything. I'm sure they're
Oh, that's because they're right here. I've
Oh.
got them handy. I'm no fool. I wasn't born yesterday, buddy. All right, so first thing, let's pretend that we're talking to people who have no idea who you are. So tell us a little bit about your inclination to write. How did you get started? What led up to it?
Well, basically, I've been a writer of different sorts of things for most of my adult life. I've written songs. I wrote a musical called John and Jen that was produced off Broadway a long time ago and then revived pretty recently. Humor pieces for newspapers, the New York Times, and other periodicals. But the idea of writing books for children was never on my radar, and it was not something that I could have foreseen happening. But when I had three kids of my own, Charlie, Joe, and Jack, and they all decided to be non-readers, the first thing that happened was I banged my head against the wall trying to get them to read and find books for them to read. And yep, spoiler alert, that led to the fact that I said, I can't find anything that seems to interest my kids. Why don't I try to write something about them, inspired by them, named after them? Charlie Joe Jackson became the main character. And I was lucky because this was 10 years ago, almost exactly. And the Wimpy Kid series had come out, and the book business had discovered the reluctant reader demographic that really made them realize, wait a second, there's gold to be mined in them Thar Hills. And they realized that if they marketed and created books that could appeal to quote unquote reluctant readers, and mainly boy reluctant readers, they could tap an untapped market basically. And so my books, my first book was pitched kind of right on the heels of the success of that series. So I was able to find a publisher, editor, a publisher fairly quickly. That ended up being a 9-book series, and that led me down this incredible path, this midlife curveball journey that I never saw coming, and I've been doing it ever since.
Oh, I love it. And knowing all three of your boys, a sense of humor is vital in the Greenwald household.
Absolutely.
And when you think about it, reluctant readers, boy, one of the best ways to invite them in is get them laughing right
Yeah.
away.
Very true. I will often get asked, like, what's the most satisfying thing about being a writer of books for kids? And there's two answers. The first is when I get an email from a kid who says, I didn't like to read, and then I discovered your books and they're so funny, and I've read them all, and now I tolerate reading. You know, they are. It's not a 0 to 60 situation. A kid has to gradually learn to accept books and welcome books into their life. But if they tell me that they now realize that reading isn't the enemy, that's good enough for me. That's a good start. They're on the path to becoming readers. But the other thing I like is when I get a book from a kid who says, I love to read, but I still thought your books were hilarious. And for my more recent sports books that aren't chock full of laughs, by the way, they're much more serious. I
Mm.
love getting emails from kids or teachers or parents who say, I don't like football, but it's Game Changer was great because it's not really about football. And I don't like, or I'm not a huge fan of basketball, but I thought Rivals was really an interesting book, and it didn't bother me that I'm not a basketball player because there's so much more to it than basketball. So it's one of those examples of the classic cliche that's literal in this case. Don't judge a book by its cover, because I try to make my books appeal to a wide range of people, boys and girls, readers and non-readers, sports fans and non-sports fans. I try to write female characters with as much depth as male characters. And so as I was accepted into the publishing world as a maker of books for reluctant readers, I've tried to expand that base a little bit to make books for everyone, because that's the most satisfying way to go at it.
Oh, I love it. First, before I'm going to delve into Rivals, but before I do, I wanted to make a plug for, I don't know if it even still exists, but John Sheska. I taught his son, in fact, in Brooklyn years ago.
Wow.
Hey, Jake. Anyway, John Sheska has a website called Guys Read,
Yes.
and he created it for this very reason, to say, get on in here, fellas. We got some good stuff for you here.
Yeah, he
So
did.
do you know him? Have you met him?
I've met him at a couple festivals, and
Yeah.
he's kind of the godfather of him and Jeff Kinney, the author of the Wimpy Kid series,
Yeah.
and John are the godfathers of reluctant reader books. They
He'll
kind of
make you an offer you can't refuse. So
he basically built, helped build the industry and helped the publishing industry realize that this kind of audience needed to be attended to. You
yeah.
don't write off kids just because they don't like to read. Graphic novels kind of sprung out of some of that early efforts to get kids to read. And he was also one of these guys who convinced the publishing industry and the librarian and the educational industry that there's no such thing as a bad book. There's no such thing as a book you don't want a kid to pick up. There's no such thing as a book that's too young for somebody. There's no such thing as a book that has too many pictures. There's no such thing as a book that's inappropriately uh, juvenile for a particular reader. If a kid goes into the library and says, "I want to read this," as long as it's not age inappropriate upward, and it's too mature, then there's no saying no, and there's no such thing as a stigma attached to a 12-year-old who picks up a book that's supposedly for a 10-year-old, or a 9-year-old picking up a book for a 12-year-old, or any sort of book is a step in the right direction. And John and these guys were some of the first to convince the education industry and the publishing industry that that was so. And that
Yeah.
has given rise to the graphic novel industry, which of course is massive now.
It is fascinating. So I love that you mentioned that, this thing is basically a laugh a minute, and this thing makes you stop and think and feel and ask yourself what you would have done in this situation. I mean, it's really, you dig in. Like, I don't sport. I know nothing about sports. So I saw this and I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
Lots of sports, but I'm here to tell you there is some really wonderful character development and ethical quandaries.
Thank you.
Uh, First thing I want to ask is, overall, there's a sense in the book throughout that the adults are putting too much pressure on the kids.
Mhm.
And that comes through very much in the sport situation, but it also comes through in terms of, you need to be this in the family, we need you to be this way, we need you to be this way academically. And I was hoping you would speak a little bit to, why did you get into that theme? Because I think a lot of kids are going to relate to that as they read this book.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because it's really the reason I wrote the book before that, which is this is Game Changer, which I wrote after writing maybe 15 or so books that were along the lines of Charlie Joe Jackson in terms of their tone and their attitude, they were filled with wiseacre kids and giggles and some silliness. And I tried to always incorporate some thought-provoking themes in those books, but the goal was to get kids to chuckle on every page, as you said. And then I was kind of kicking around ideas for something new, and I really wanted to see if I could pull off a more serious topic. And I've always been a sports lover. I have 3 kids, 2 of whom played sports throughout high school, 1 of whom played sports for most of his career as a kid, and then he veered off into acting. But I found sports, and I still find sports, kind of this fascinating dichotomy of as many wonderful things about it as there are worrying things about it. And youth sports especially encapsulates so much of that, because the bonding, the team building, the friendships, the learning how to win and lose gracefully and graciously, and the lessons you take from the experiences on the field or the court are lifelong and invaluable. But there's also just an enormous amount of pressure that is now a part of kids' lives in general. It's not just sports, by the way. It can be a kid who's in dance class, or and a kid who's an actor or a singer. It's just part of growing up now, that the pressures upon kids usually started by adults and then ultimately transferred onto the kid themselves, and they learn to put as much pressure on themselves as adults have put on them. It really gave me pause watching my kids play. And I don't say this as a scold from the outside. I say this as one who was sucked into the system. And as a parent of kids who played, I was incredibly emotionally invested in whether they would do well, whether they would win or lose, how good they were and compared to everybody else. My mind was spinning in terms of, are they good enough to do this? Are they good enough to play on this travel team? Are they good enough to possibly play in college? So I was a part of the system. And it's a system that has a couple of things that I felt were worth exploring in children's literature, but primarily the feeling of pressure around what is supposed to be just fun. Going out and playing a game, winning, losing, ultimately it doesn't matter. In a week, no one will care, but it's become life or death, the illusion of life or death, and it's just not healthy. And so that's why I wrote this first book, Game Changer, which is based on not fact, but what I saw as the culture of youth football and middle school and high school football. I had one son who played football, my youngest Jack, and he absolutely loved it. And I absolutely loved watching him play. But as I was watching, I was just aware that there were things about it that were probably worth exploring. And so I touch on all of that stuff in that book, and hazing and the danger of football specifically, but also I make clear that there's incredibly wonderful and valuable things about sports and youth sports too. And so after writing that, I and my publisher decided that was successful enough that I would try it again. And so I turned to basketball, which has its own hotbed of pressures attached to it. And there's some class differences in the new book Rivals.
Oh my gosh, I loved the class differences.
Yeah.
You know, because true transparency, like where you and I live is a pretty affluent space.
It is indeed.
And I personally grew up on the other side of the tracks. So it's interesting for me to be keenly aware as a kid of what the adults never talked about, which is, you know, so-and-so has a lot of money, so-and-so doesn't have a lot of money, and there's some assumptions made about people's character. And that comes up in a wonderful way in the book, but I'm not going to give it away because you got to read the book to get into it. But the way you handled that, I don't see very often in middle school literature. Usually kids are kind of in their own socioeconomic world. So that contrast was great, and you handled it beautifully. So read the book. But I also wanted to address, like, it's largely boys are the main characters in here, but there's a very significant girl character who caught my eye, and she's the journalist. Will you tell me a little bit more about, it's Alfie, right?
Yeah, Alfie.
Alfie Jenks, yeah.
She really came about because I wanted a stand-in for the audience, like a surrogate for the reader. And she goes through a journey much like I hope a reader might go through. She starts out as she's a sports nerd. She
Yeah.
wanted to be an athlete herself. She wasn't gifted enough to kind of pursue it on the field or on the court, but she found this niche, and she's an incredibly talented sports journalist, middle school journalist. She has a blog. She runs the school radio station, such as it is. She has a incredibly idealistic attitude toward youth sports at the beginning of the book. But as the story unfolds and as she helps to uncover aspects of the story, she realizes, along with the reader, that there's more to youth sports than meets the eye, that just happens on the field. There's behind the scenes machinations, and there's some scandals, and there's some untoward behavior, and she becomes a little wise by the end of the book, and she realizes that this is a complicated issue, and if I'm going to be a sports journalist and a sports fan, I have to tell all sides of the story, not just the easy, glorious, to the victor go the spoils stories, but the kind of seamy underside of it as well. And I wanted to make her a girl because it just seemed much more interesting.
Mhm.
It's kind of as simple as that.
Yeah, fair enough. And you know, the cool thing about the generation now is that they have a much more a broad understanding of gender, and
Yeah.
it's actually very exciting times for people like you and me who grew up with, like, you go in one door or you go in the other door. Now it's very different.
Yeah.
But there's another thing that you raised during her process that that's a kind of cool device, that she's a stand-in for the reader. I really like that. And I'm going to get to some like writerly kind of stuff with you in a second. But there was another thing that came up, which is the level of possibility that comes with a sincere apology.
Mhm.
Like, you really feel when you're reading this book, you're just like, oh, this person got themselves in a jam. This person hurt somebody else and they're just realizing it. But the power of apology in your book strikes me as a beautiful theme, not just among the kids, not just among the rivals, but there was some real reconciliation between parents and kids as well. And I'm just curious what fed into that for you.
It's a good question. And I hadn't thought of it that way thematically. You're absolutely right that Alfie is on both sides of an apology in this book. She herself jumps to conclusions and reports something that turns out not to be the truth, and it puts others in a difficult situation, and she is gracious and realizes her mistake and vows to be better. And she is lucky that she has the ear of um, one of the sympathetic adults in the book, who happens to be her kind of guidance counselor and mentor, who also appears in Game Changer, by the way, as a guidance counselor, because they take place in the same town. And then later on in the book, she herself is badly wronged. And unlike how she handles it, the person who wrongs her cannot deal with it. And he is unable to apologize. And her situation becomes more and more dire as a result of it. And it's only toward the very end of the book that they reconcile. And I think the power of how she handles it and how gracefully she handles it comes from the fact that she's been there. She knows what it's like to make a mistake. She knows what it's like to realize you've behaved in a way that has hurt other people.
Yeah.
And so she kind of floats above the fray with this air of grace throughout the book that I think helps the boy who wronged her ultimately see what it's like to act in a graceful fashion, and it helps him redeem himself as well.
And there's almost a ripple effect that happens in the community as people take ownership of how they had hurt each other, and that takes so much courage. It
Yeah.
even affects the adults. It kind of like trickles up to the adults, which is kind of awesome. And I've also seen that happen. I've definitely seen young people take the lead on calling stuff out, apologizing, being vulnerable. And
Yeah.
in a way, it helps the adults drop their defenses a little bit too. But it all has to be earned. And you're absolutely right about the word grace. So how about I ask you a question or two about your writing process? Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay. First of all, have you heard of Nanowrimo?
Yes,
Nanowrimo.
I have
And
indeed.
YWP stands for Young Writers Program. For those of you watching this, get into it. It's the whole month of November, and you set yourself a word count goal, and you get on and you just write fast and furious, and you get a community of people around you. So tell me your connection to NaNoWriMo, Tommy.
I just know of it. Is the idea of it ultimately to finish a book in November, or just to write a certain number of words per day in November?
It started out as literally an adult challenge to other adults to write 50,000 words in 1 month, which
That's a lot.
it comes to like 1,667 words per day. And don't you skip a day, because then that gets added to your next day. But younger people can set their own word count goal, but there's all kinds of wonderful supportive stuff. So I was just curious about that. And this
No,
is
I
a little,
have heard about it, and it's actually strikes close to home for me, because when I am in a writing mode, and admittedly my writing modes go up and down if I'm in the middle of a book, if I have a deadline, I am very much a word count aficionado. I don't do pages, I don't do chapters. I want to write a certain number of words per day. A thousand is my minimum. Anything above that is gravy. And they have to be good words, or at least decent enough words to be a first draft. And that's kind of how I build my way through toward my ultimate goal. And sometimes I go so far as to have a document to track my word count. And it's sounds very scientific and less romantic. Is like, you write when inspiration strikes, and you sit down, and it's not really like that for me.
that's exactly how I write too, just so you know.
That's a high keyboard. You want the keyboard up here. I'm staring at the word count saying, okay, I'm 600, 700. It's a job. There's no other real way to describe it. The first book I wrote on the train going in and out of the city to my day job. And that was kind of the old fashioned romantic way of looking at writing. I had an idea. I wanted to see the idea through. I wrote it whenever I could. I grabbed an hour here, an hour there. And I would look back at that kind of with fond longing, because as much of a blessing as it's been to be able to write more books, as one goes along, it becomes more of a routine and more of a job and more of a pressurized situation that you have to do this by this day. And you can't kind of get away with going, I'm going to write when the inspiration strikes. You have a job to do, you have deadlines to meet, you have contracts to fulfill, and you have to figure out a way to do it. And I've always had another job. I've always kept my day job the whole time. So it's been slightly trickier for me to figure out when I would do it, either on the train or on the weekends. I'd go to the library. I like to write at the library. I like to write at Barnes and Noble, or the old Barnes and
Gee,
Noble.
which library do you like to write at? Just checking. Could that be the Westport Library?
That's the one.
Okay.
That's the very one.
Just a little shout out.
Before the pandemic, I never wrote at home. I would always leave to write, because it felt like I was going off to work. And I kind of have always equated home with relaxation and watching TV and playing with my dogs. And doing not much of anything particularly productive. And
Yeah, your decompression zone. You
yeah,
know, it's interesting what you talk about the discipline of writing. It's one of the cool things about NaNoWriMo because you shift away from the content to literally the word count.
yeah,
And it starts to build that muscle of production. Just sit down and produce. And it's actually a wonderful discipline. But one of the things, you know, I don't want you to give the impression that writing is just like, now it's just grim. You sit down, you attach your shackles, and you do this.
No, I do not want to keep that impression. Pull me
But
back from that. Pull me back.
well, the way I'm going to pull you back is actually a reflection of your progression. Interestingly enough, this is the first book I read by you, and it was hilarious. It was very lighthearted and just a delight. This is like an, ooh, this is fun cotton candy. And then, but this is deep. Like I got a lot out of this. I had a lot of empathy for the characters. I cared about their ethical dilemmas. So in a way, you're still producing, but even though you're like, I got to produce X number, you challenged yourself to go deeper and to try new things. So I don't think the job part of a writer gets in the way of the enjoyment. I think you set yourself new challenges. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, it's completely accurate. I had an interesting journey with the first of these books, Game Changer, because I had taken it to my publisher. I was at Scholastic at that point. I had just come off this other series I'd written, Project Z, which is about a boy zombie who gets rescued and he tries to pass as a regular elementary school student. And it had a bit of adventure in it, and it has a lot of giggles in it. And so it was kind of expected of me by this publisher to keep churning out that kind of stuff. And when I showed up with Game Changers, they were like, "This is great, but we're not going to publish it because your brand is a certain brand at our publishing house, and we don't want to confuse the readership and by changing that brand." Which kind of took me aback a little bit because I thought it was a book worth publishing, and ultimately I found another publisher for it. So it's almost, I don't want to say the industry discourages you from spreading your wings and trying new things, but you are pigeonholed to some extent by the kinds of books you write, especially if you're writing multiple series that have a similar thematic and attitude toward them. And so when you show up with something different, it's not necessarily received with accolades like, "Wow, you've expanded your horizons. This is great. We can't wait to publish it." The reaction is concern and possibly confusion to the point where they don't, you get turned down, you get rejected. And so any writer who wants to spread their creative wings into another direction has to be prepared to butt up against some of the norms of the industry and plow right through them so that you can kind of continue to create and to challenge yourself.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that because I have grown concerned as an old teacher. I've grown concerned about the increasing commodification of everything. Like kids are thinking of themselves as a brand. I've
Yeah.
known kids who like, my TikTok is me doing these amazing trick shots. But I'm just like, but there's so much more to you. And so I think we all have to be rebels and
Yeah.
reject some of that pigeonholing. Okay, I have another writer question for you. You ready?
Yes, go.
Okay. What percentage of your first draft makes it into the final book?
62%.
Ooh, so precise. Tell me more.
I said that for my kids because they always mock me that I use 62 for everything. For some reason, that's my number of choice when I like throw out an exaggeration. It's like, I told you to take the garbage out 62 times. Why haven't you done it yet?
Me too.
That kind of thing. But actually, it's about that. If I'm honest, I would say that I plow through a first draft as quickly as possible. It's the hardest part of the writing process for me because you're creating something out of scratch, and I want to get it over with as quickly as possible. And a lot of times while I'm in the middle of the first draft, I'm like, God, this is a complete mess. This is a horror show. I'm gonna have to redo the whole thing. Then I will work my way to the end of the first draft. I will go back and read it. And I almost always go, okay, it's not terrible. It needs a lot of work, but it's not the train wreck I thought it might be or was concerned it might be. And then I start to rewrite, which I enjoy. I like to kind of go through my first draft, jettison what doesn't work, figure out ways to solve problems. There's often inconsistencies in character or events or chronology that you discover when you go back and read something, because you have to be a slave to chronology and making sure the events line up in an appropriate way, and you have to tell the audience where you are chronologically in the story at all times, a few days later or the following Monday. And you kind of have to make sure that all makes sense. And also characters mutate along the way. Sometimes they just go where my fingers take them, and they could go in a direction that makes something they did earlier in a draft make no sense. And so those things you have to clean up too. But that's kind of finishing the puzzle, which I really do enjoy. And the bones of a first draft are usually sturdy enough that I can kind of work through that and work around them and make the appropriate changes without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm gonna stick with my initial answer, 62%.
62%. I love that that's an Easter egg for your boys. I'm going to plant an Easter egg for your boys as well, because they took a summer creative writing class with me, and I started the first day with this story.
Okay.
Winston Churchill, right? Who
Mhm.
championed England through World War II, helped them stay gritty through the bombing and the desolation, stronger. So he retires, right? And he's out in the countryside, and he's got an easel set up, and he's got the best paints because he's Winston Churchill. He's in some like manor out there, and he's sitting there all afternoon with this blank canvas, till finally a friend of the family comes along. Winston, what bloody hell do you think you're doing out here? And Winston was like, I'm painting. And he's like cranky. She's like, the blazes you are. And she scoops one of the brushes and she paints a great big X on the canvas. She said, there, now you're painting. And so I just love that. So if you're ever afraid of starting something, just remember someone as powerful as Winston Churchill sat there looking at the blank thing like, yeah. So just conquer the power of that blank canvas. Just get something on there. And like you said, 62% may work out.
I have a quick story that's a lot like that. My day job,
oh, good.
Doing commercials for Broadway shows, plays and musicals. And we were doing a show with Elaine Stritch, this incredible old actress who was passed on a couple years ago, but a total character. And I had to write a radio spot for her. And I had to take it to her dressing room where she was performing downtown and show it to her. And I went there. I was a little nervous. She's quite a character and a legend, and an old curmudgeonly gal. And she read it and she goes, I just have one change. And she took the Sharpie that I brought and put an X through the entire thing. I was like, that's your only change? Okay, we're in good shape. She ended up being a complete delight, of course. But
that's amazing.
She was just testing me, and I have that framed X'd out script in my
I would too.
Yeah.
Holy cow. That's what you keep from that interaction. You keep that thing. All right. So I'm going to land this with 2 quick questions. Yeah. I want one weird fact about your writing process. Maybe it's where you write, maybe it's what you eat, but I want some deliciously detailed weird thing about your writing habits.
Okay. This is really more appropriate to pre-pandemic. Because you're kind of forced to write by yourself. But in normal times, the more uncomfortable I am, the better I write physically. And I think that starts because I think that kind of goes back to my first book when I was writing squished on a train between 2 people. And so I don't like to be comfortable or relaxed I like noise, chaos, a noisy bookstore, a hard chair squeezed between two people. I want to feel uncomfortable and feel very distracted. There's a line in the Charlie Joe books where he gets grounded and things get taken away from him, and he's unable to do his homework because he doesn't have his devices. And he says, "How do you expect me to concentrate without my distractions?" And that, that kind of comes from me. Like I need
Yeah.
a lot around me to be able to focus.
I used to perform at various theaters in New York City comedy. And one of the things is you want the audience a little uncomfortable for comedy. So
Definitely.
UCB used to have this theater that was in the basement
Yeah,
underneath the
I know
Gristedes.
that there.
Yeah, so yeah, I spent a lot of time there.
And Dave
But yeah,
Letterman
like,
left his studio at like 57 degrees. He wanted his audience freezing. Letterman.
oh my gosh, I love it. I love it. Okay, kids, so the secret to good writing is torture yourself. And just very important that you come away with that lesson. And finally, other than you, because you're a peach, who is the most fun author that you've hung out with? I want you to spill some tea.
Well, we're in a lovely little enclave of children's book authors. There are so many around here. And there's a group of us that have lunch or brunch once a month, again, in non-pandemic times, but we're just starting up again. And they're all wonderful people. There's Lauren Tarshish, who writes the I Survived books. There's Victoria Kahn, who writes the Pinkalicious books. Alan Katz, who's a hilarious writer. Elise Broach, who writes wonderful literary novels. And Hans Wilhelm, who's an incredible writer, illustrator. These are all great people, and we get together on a semi-regular basis, and we talk shop for a little while, and then we leave that behind and talk everything else. And there's other great writers around who, I mean, the children's book community is vast, but it's also insular. And again, in normal times, you all circuit around to the same events and festivals and see the same faces. So it's a great privilege to be a part of that community.
I think that's good to know, because I'm kind of speaking not just to you, but to the audience of potentially young aspiring writers. I would just wanted to give them a little flavor that it's not a lonely profession where you're shackled to your desk doing this by yourself in a 57-degree room with only 62% of your words making it to the final draft. We don't want you to think it's
Oh,
that miserable.
you've retained a lot. I'm impressed.
Hey, it's my improv training,
And
my
you got
friend.
it all out in one sentence. Not bad.
This is, I was getting ready for the button because I know we have to wrap it up. This is an improv technique. So it's been a total pleasure. It's really great to see you. Say hi to your boys. And we're so delighted that the Westport Library runs these incredible series and conversations that people can come by and learn and share and grow. It's awesome. I'm a big fan.
And if anybody has any questions, just email me at tommy@tommygreenwald.com. Happy to answer any and all.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing your time and making me laugh for this whole time. Remember, those of you at home, you can order Rise now or at your favorite bookstore, or borrow a copy from the library. And for more author videos, events, and information, check out westportlibrary.org. Thank you both so much, and I can't wait to read Rivals now.
Excellent. Let me know what you think. I hope you like at least 62% of it.
Well played.
Bye.
Bye.